I am your host, Dan Cluche. So, in this part four vlog on energy and specifically on oil, we'll begin by looking at this graphic, which shows that 93.5 of current known reserves are in these 14 countries. Also, particularly of interest is that both Venezuela and Canada saw very large increases in their quote proven oil reserves um, due to heavy oil. We don't take exception to those being truly proven reserves. The only thing we point out is the energy intensity of heavy oil and melting literally essentially tar to extract the oil and using enormous amounts of natural gas to do that and leaving an energy return on investment of say 1 unit of energy in for 3 maybe 4 units of energy out. So that is the current oil environment as we know it. And it wasn't that long ago, even in the 1980s, that heavy oil was well known, literally going back to the time of the natives, um, literally using bitumen as part of the canoe making process and so forth. And so we've known of these reserves for a long time. Now, of course, we also know that there's a tremendous number of products or types of products that are petroleum based. And so this graphic does a nice job of showing a number of these things. And as excited and interested as we are in solar PV and wind, of course, they don't on their own replace many of these uses. We do have an effort today to say, well, we're going to replace gasoline and maybe diesel with electric vehicles. But there's really important and large uses down here of just every imaginable type. So, what we end up really needing to understand when we contemplate that is when we look at billions of barrels of conventional oil discovered since 1947. In 1947, we had a giant year and we had some very good years in the 50s and 60s and so forth. But you can see the decline that has been taking place worldwide, as reported by Bloomberg, all the way out to recent times. And when you would add the most recent years from 2015 to 2021, they are still at you know 2016 like levels, and not a whole lot of change on that front. So we can actually look not just at those 14 countries that I just mentioned, but we can look at how many countries have attained peak production um, since 2010 and have seen their production dropping or witnessed the same thing since the 1970s, such as we saw with say Libya, Kuwait, Iran, and so forth. And so obviously very material numbers and very real and pretty difficult to refute as near as I can tell. The US has been an exception. In 1970, we began to see a drop off from the peak. We had some very strong finds in Alaska and Purdue Bay. And so that meant that we staved off peak production, um, and for a while, and then with the advent of starting to produce tight oil, which also is about a 1 to 3 energy return on investment. We ended up achieving some new highs for a period of time. We certainly expended an enormous amount of capital to achieve that. Not a whole lot of tight oil or shale oil companies actually achieved profits on that. Some did very well by producing proven reserves and selling, like XTO did, with Exxon buying at a pretty high rate. So one of the analysts that I like to follow is Art Berman with Labyrinth Consulting. I think he just is very studious on the numbers. And what Art ends up saying is that um, while there are estimates that suggest the fall off of tight oil will be relatively slow, um, he's not very convinced. He does call it his dumbass case, but I believe that it's not unfair to say, as a betting individual, he would probably only bet on that case. Um, and we can see why these costs have gone up so much. Just looking at things like how many horizontal lateral lengths did we have to increase our horizontal wells by, just to produce that shale oil or tight oil. And from 2012 to 2018, we saw a 44% increase in these lengths. We saw a huge increase in the amount of water used. And of course, what that really translates to, most importantly, is that we had an enormous amount of truck trips to bring that water and propellant to these sites. And so, of course, we use typically diesel, no electric trucks so far, or just yet. But very energy intensive, lots of water, and therefore lots of cost. And so all of that contributed to these kinds of charts for the various shale oil and gas players. It's gotten to be a better picture recently with oil prices having shot up as they have. But nevertheless, costs are still very high. And so many people will talk at great length and say, we had U.S. Energy independence. And in recent years, there had been some factual basis to state that, etc. But nevertheless, by 2021, we saw, despite not having a new Keystone pipeline in place, Canada at 51.3% of U.S. Oil imports, and a fair number of other countries participating in that. And with all that, regardless, we still see really fast rising energy prices. So we've seen lots of up and down motion for a number of reasons. Middle East cartels in the 70s driving these things. Wars have long been a big factor in these kinds of seesaw pricing. But nevertheless, what we end up seeing is that in recent years, when the prices have come down, they're very much too low for most of the producers to make any money, let alone continue their exploration budgets. And then when we've seen the prices rapidly rise as they have now, it's really too high for consumers, and it does cause rippling inflation all through the economy, exactly as we are seeing as of this moment. So we end up very concerned about commuter miles and time spent idling in heavy traffic. We'll often hear that, North America being as spread out and suburban as it is, that, we have kind of the worst of the worst of these traffic hours. But it's quite fascinating to me to look at these numbers, granted back in 2012. Haven't seen it updated since, but basically we can go around the chart and we can look at big cities in Belgium, and they spend even more time in traffic than Los Angeles or New York, and traffic congested places like that. Paris is very noteworthy, as is Lyon. In Germany, Stuttgart and Cologne and so forth are very high, obviously. Milan, the Netherlands, large cities are very slow moving traffic events, as is London and Manchester. So, the world ends up in this kind of place with spending a lost work week per year in traffic. And of course, that can be worrisome with electric vehicles. But it's even more worrisome when we look at it from a Canadian standpoint and taxes. So if we take $100 that we've earned and we had to pay $33 in tax, and then we buy $67 worth of fuel, and we pay the associated tax that the governments charge against that, being $32.16 plus GST, it means that the government got $71.86 of that $100. And so we really have some very extraneous and strange things in the mix. They're, of course, allegedly designed to cause us to change our behavior and drive less and move to public transit or what have you. Of course, in North America, being as suburban as we are, that is really much easier said than done, of course. And so, despite how much we've seen since 1998, these rapid price increases up and down and so forth, we do not see our US and Canadian numbers will be very similar when graphed. Annual consumption moving up and down all that much. It's rather consistent, and the only thing that creates a low is when we have very heavy recessionary years, which we seem to be having now. And with this large volume of consumption draining the U.S. strategic reserve, allegedly does something price wise. It's not that material of amount, but if there's an emergency, it could be a really big deal. And then when we look at these transportation cost comparisons, I find it interesting to note that we can see the diesel prices in red. Um, since 2011, when we are able to use compressed natural gas and buses and some other vehicles that have been designed for that, we see a pretty substantial price decrease, and nicely also a decrease in GHG footprint. The LNG numbers quite surprise me. I would be very curious to see what they'll look like over the next year or three. And whether we're using B20, or which is 20% biodiesel, or 100% biodiesel, we see that that typically has been at a premium price. Of course, predominantly all of that biodiesel has been being produced by soybeans. And so that really sets up a food versus fuel debate, which is not admirable. And so we'll look at some alternatives. And so when we look at a map of the U.S. and we say, well, what would happen if we planted all the acreage that we would need to grow enough corn to produce enough ethanol to replace 50% of the current U.S. Petroleum diesel usage? And we find there isn't enough land mass. And with soybean, it's not really any better. And so you can see what I'm talking about as why that, from a food versus fuel debate, would be completely unacceptable. That said, back in 2008, Chevron was working heavily on algae, and they looked and they said, gee, we would need a very small relative landmass to produce 50% of the US petroleum diesel with algae. Of course, there's technical issues, so it's not like we could just say, okay, perfect, let's do that. But it's also worth pointing out that unlike soybean and corn, this algae production can be salt water production and a relatively small amount of surface area. So overcoming the technical challenges is potentially really interesting. You can grow algae in these types of greenhouses at sea or on land, and potentially in not food productive land. The biggest technical challenges is how do you dewater and separate the lipids within the cell structures of the algae in a not energy intense way, so that you dramatically exceed, hopefully, that 1 to 3 energy return on investment scenario that we're seeing in other energy sources. And then the larger you go in factory production, water being the giver of life, algae production typically wanting a monoculture, you're really fighting nature on that. The more water you have, the more species of life tend to emerge, and we want a monoculture for algae quality control. So those are high level and quickly the technical challenges that have somewhat foiled algae production for these things. However, some of that is just really caused by a huge resistance to do anything but the age of the big. Really big growing, big refineries, thus enormous amount of production of algae in monoculture. And what you'll do, or what you'll find if you study it, is that if you do these things on a smaller scale, your challenges with Mother Nature and what she wants to do with water becomes dramatically diminished. And so there's some exciting things there. Project I've been involved with Sprung Structures and the Horse Lake First Nations is taking wood waste, running it through essentially a hybrid pyrolysis process. Growing algae is ultimately what was done or is done in this greenhouse. You can see it at a more advanced stage of construction in algae raceways, as you see here. And then behind this clear membrane wall is all the production that allows us to take wood waste, algae production, and end up creating wood vinegars and excellent soil amendments for the regenerative forestry efforts that are so needed when we're harvesting biomass. So really exciting project. Just shows the value of algae, but there's so much more. You can look at Bloom here, and they make runners out of algae. University of Cambridge has done some work, and they're showing how they can run computers with algae. So very exciting. Shows you the directions that energy is going and how important regenerative agriculture is in that. And the AgriHub group of companies, which are our sponsors, recognize these things and are moving forward with their customers on these sorts of solutions. And we certainly welcome you reaching out to us if you would like to collaborate on such projects. We look forward to having you join us on part 5, which will be on coal. Thank you.